A very, very good evening to everybody, and thank you for coming along. And we are absolutely delighted to have Sean Hudson here, who is the branch secretary for the Subpostmasters of the CWU, the Communication Workers Union. So we're very, very pleased to have him here today to talk about the ongoing, as it seems. I followed the scan. I followed this, in the papers, and I thought, well, they've had their convictions overturned, so everything's okay now. And of course, that's not true at all. The compensation is still being haggled over. I mean, it's just appalling. So I'll say no more anyway, than to hand over to Sean Hudson to give us a lead-off talk on this.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you this evening. Just a little bit of, if you like, kind of housekeeping as to who I am and what's what. I have probably what's described as a varied career portfolio. I've been a sub-postmaster for the last 7 years. I am, in addition, also a lawyer, which I've been lawyering for the last 25 years or more. And I actually still have a partnership share in a firm in which I'm a partner in Northumberland. I'm now also the National Branch Secretary for the Subpostmasters. And that comes about because in 2017, which is the date on which my wife and I took our sub-post office in our village, by then, although Post Office Limited had stopped any criminal prosecutions of postmasters, presumably because they were realizing on the back of the Clark advice, which we can talk about later, that it wasn't very safe for them to carry on doing that. They weren't, however, trying to actively unravel the mess that they'd got themselves into. So one of the first things that I did when I became a sub-postmaster was to join the Communication Workers Union, which had a branch force of postmasters, which had been operating since about 2014, when a very clever and wise chap by the name of Mark Baker had started the branch off. Now, a little bit of who's who and what's what. You may have heard at various times mention of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. And I think a lot of people, although I've no doubt that anybody here will be under the same misapprehension, but a lot of the general public are under the misapprehension that the Federation is the Postmasters Trade Union. Well, it's not. It's not a union at all. It lost its trade union status in 2014. They had the opportunity to amalgamate with another trade union and retain or regain such a status. But they abandoned that possibility in favour of remaining as a trade association. And then you see there's a bit of dodgy dealings that goes on as well, because in 2013, the Federation of Sub-Postmasters, they entered into a grant funding arrangement. It's only latterly that the grant funding arrangements become a public document, or people have known about it more generally. But this GFA, the terms of it were such that the NFSP, the Federation, has paid £2.5 million per year under a 15-year agreement with Post Office Limited. But there are conditions to this grant, and one of the principal conditions is that they don't say or do anything that would, in effect, badmouth Post Office. So in effect, they're required not to cross Post Office. And I think this is where a lot of the problems arose as Horizon was introduced and the problems started to come to light with it. So we have a situation as well in which we've got various types of post office. We've got a mains post office, which is the one that probably people are most familiar with historically. That's the one with the big fortress screen across it. And then we've got the local post office model, which is the one which is probably more common now. Historically, we remember the mains, but now we remember the local, or we see the local one, which is the one that doesn't have that fortress counter in front of it. You're actually completely open to the public. And then you have what's known as a community branch as well. And we have outreach branches. Community branches, as the name suggests, are branches that are run within the community by the community. And there's still some kind of a postmaster salary attached to that. And an outreach post office is one that goes out in a van and reaches out to communities that don't have a post office. So before Horizon, post offices, whatever they may have been, whatever model, and they were principally mains, they all worked on the basis of paper-based accounts. And the contract that a sub-postmaster had with post office at that time held the sub-postmaster responsible for all losses. That wasn't too bad whilst we had paper accounts, because if you found at the end of the week that you had a problem in your balance, you could drill down into the figures because you had them. They were paper-based and you can look back and you could find it. But then in 1999, the government and post office introduced Horizon. So although everything became computer-based as a result of Horizon, the sub-postmaster's contract didn't change. The sub-postmaster's contract remained the same, which was he was responsible or she was responsible for all losses, notwithstanding the fact that the postmaster couldn't drill down into the accounts anymore. If there was a problem, they were at the mercy of the Horizon computer and they couldn't get into the back office to see what was going on. So with that background of who's who, what's what, we then have our final countdown of what goes on between 1999 and the present day. And I'll try and take us for a fairly quick spin through this. There were, as we all know, a number of problems which started to appear. The position that the post office took and the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters was that where there was a problem, the postmaster experiencing the problem was the only postmaster, and it wasn't happening to anybody else. And of course, back then, before the advent of the internet, and people being able to network and communicate with each other much more easily, if you were told you were the only one, you had no way of knowing that, in fact, there were others like you who were experiencing the same difficulties. And there's a few notable cases that pop up between 1999 and 2014, and some of these were in the Bates v Post Office TV drama, one of which was Lee Castleton, who was experiencing, as you saw in the drama, a number of problems in his branch. And in fact, he approached the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters for help, and they refused to help him and actually sent his membership fee back to him, because at that time, to be a member of the NFSP, you paid a membership fee. You don't do that now. You're auto-enrolled as soon as you become a sub-postmaster. So it was quite clear at that stage that the NFSP were actually supporting Post Office with the line that sub-postmasters who were having problems with Horizon were the only ones. And it was because of this and the difficulties that people that were encountering that Alan Bates, by about 2019, he actually formed the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. And he did this largely as a result of the fact that the NFSP refused to represent its members. As we just saw, they returned Lee Castleton's membership to him. Seema Misra was another case, I think, that was shown up in the drama as well. Seema was actually given a 15-month sentence of imprisonment while she was pregnant for Horizon irregularities. Tracy Felsted was another. She was actually directly employed by Post Office Limited, and she was jailed for a year, and I think she was only 18 years old at the time. But as these cases started to percolate through and people started to collect the dots, connect the dots, thanks largely to Alan Bates, the ear of MPs, in particular Lord Arbuthnot, was caught by certain sub-postmasters who were complaining to their MPs. And again, the dots were starting to be connected. And as a result of this, as MPs were going to Post Office, the Post Office appointed second sight forensic accountants to look into the discrepancies that were being reported. And I think at the time that second sight were appointed, I think the the thought had been, they must have thought they were going to be able to tame the forensic accountants and bring them to heel. But in fact, that's not what actually happened, because by 2013, the interim report from Second Sight was published, and it revealed quite major concerns about defects in Horizon. So far from it backing up Post Office and backing up the NFSP as to the robustness of Horizon, it was actually flagging up its own concerns in relation to that. And around about the same time, Post Office Limited, under pressure, I think, from Lord Arbuthnot and different of the MPs who were on board with this as well, it decided that it would establish a complaint and mediation scheme, which Subpostmasters could utilise to try and get to the bottom of their discrepancies with Horizon. And then running in tandem with this, the Communication Workers Union, the Subpostmasters branch, that was established around about 2014, because by this time, Mark Baker, who was the original branch secretary for the Subpostmasters, he had actually left, I think in 2010, the Federation of Subpostmasters, largely because he was upset as an executive officer as to the way that the Federation were treating Subpostmasters with these irregularities and discrepancies. He did what he could in between times. And then in 2014, as I say, he established with Andy Fury the Postmasters branch. And the CWU branch, in fact, intervened in probably at least 100 cases at contractual level where discrepancies arose, and on more than a few occasions has actually assisted in out-of-court settlements as well for Postmasters. By 2015, we had a select committee with the Department of Business Innovation and Skills. And if anybody's interested, I'll send out the YouTube link to this select committee, because the then General Secretary of the National Federation of Subpostmasters, George Thompson, appeared in front of the select committee. And bear in mind that there was by this time, the general funding arrangement between Post Office and the National Federation of Subpostmasters. Mr. Thompson appeared in front of the committee and completely supported the robustness of Horizon, and in fact suggested that the problems were as a result of some bad apples amongst postmasters. Fortunately, that wasn't the end of the matter, because despite the fact that Post Office Limited by this time also refused to accept Second Sight's findings and actually terminated the complaint and mediation scheme, matters were pushed on by Alan Bates and his Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance. We did, however, have a situation in which the Post Office stopped prosecutions, probably largely in the face of the Justice for Subpostmasters Alliance litigation, which was bubbling up at that stage, because as you probably saw in the drama, Alan was required to find sufficient number of subpostmasters to be able to enter into a funding arrangement to be able to bring that litigation. And it was in 2017, in fact, that the litigation was launched. It took from 2017 to 2019 for the matter to actually come to its common issues trial. And at that trial, obviously, we know from the background of it, and I followed that trial quite closely, a guy called Nick Wallace, who probably a lot of you know as well, who is one of the journalists who reported the Horizon story. He live tweeted a lot of the evidence as it was coming out at the court hearings, and it was quite astonishing at times to read these tweets that were coming out and the turnaround that was taking place. And Post Office initially, I mean, we've heard the apologies now from Post Office, from government, etc., but it shouldn't be forgotten that at that time in 2019, at that trial, Post Office vigorously protested its innocence and were supported by the National Federation of Subpostmasters, who in effect, in evidence, were reported as supporting Post Office Limited's position. We then had a situation within the litigation that when Justice Fraser gave his judgment in the common issues trial, because the trial was in a number of different tranches, and one of those was the common issues trial, which was right at the very start. If that had failed, then that would have been game over for the Subpostmasters. But the fact that it succeeded meant that the next tranche of trials could go ahead to effectively assess any limitation issues and any quantum valuation issues. But because Judge Fraser's verdict or judgment was so damning of Post Office then, and again, remember the apologies that they've made to postmasters now, but don't forget the fact that once that judgment came out, they then made an application to recuse Judge Fraser from the further trials. An application to recuse a judge is pretty much unheard of. And I remember at the time that this application was made, and not even Post Office Limited's barrister on the morning that the application was being made knew that the application was being made, because it was somebody aside from him who made the application. I remember it was pretty jaw-dropping, and my immediate thought with that is this really, really, really is complete and utter desperation, because if they don't succeed with the application for Fraser to recuse himself, and I didn't think they would, then they've really pressed the nuclear option here, and it's going to backfire on them. And so it did. Judge Fraser refused to recuse himself. It then went off to the higher court, Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal heard it, and they basically lambasted Post Office Limited for having made the application. They lost on all limbs of the appeal that they had made. And that would have been great, but for the fact, again, as you probably saw in the Bates drama, the difficulty at that stage was that the money was running out. And again, let's not forget that one of the reasons that the money was running out was because Post Office Limited, when they started their defence of the litigation, their tactic was clearly to try to outspend the Subpostmasters, to outspend the funding that was available to them, and have the funders take fright and think, well, you know, we're going to have to pull the plug here, which can happen sometimes as the costs go up and up. So against that background, Alan Bates and his counsel were forced into a situation, a bit like a game of poker, really. They had to put their best poker face on and give the impression that they had more money to be able to carry on with the next stages in the litigation, whereas in fact the pot was pretty much empty. So they did a pretty good job of it, because they managed to get a settlement of £58 million, which sounded on the face of things as if it was quite a sum of money, but £48 million of that, in actual fact, went to Therium, who were the legal expense insurer funder, and they had to be paid their premium. By the time that had been done, it left on average the 555 litigants a payment of about £20,000 each. And when you bear in mind that for some of these people, they had lost their livelihoods, they had lost their reputation, they had lost their health, some had lost their lives, had lost loved ones, £20,000 really wasn't an awful lot to celebrate. And I think things, unfortunately for Alan, backfired a little in that, whereas there was a a common cause with the litigation when it first started and a common enemy in Post Office Limited. Unfortunately, when the case had to be settled, and they really had no choice about this, they had to because their pot was empty to carry on. When the litigation was settled, there were understandably perhaps some amongst the 555 who weren't very pleased with what had happened and the payments that were coming out. But it was pretty much Hobson's choice. There wasn't really an awful lot of choice about it. But one of the things that Alan Bates did do, which I don't think he gets enough credit for and really should be given credit for, is when the settlement was being negotiated, he engineered into that settlement a requirement that for postmasters going forward in the future, there should be some mechanism and some scheme for them to be able to claim their losses from Post Office. And out of that was born what's called the historical shortfall scheme. And there are a number of schemes now from which compensation is being paid to postmasters. But were it not for Alan Bates and the litigation, that scheme probably wouldn't have been born, wouldn't have been created. It might have been created at some later stage as a result of the TV drama, but nobody knew that the story was going to make that big a splash as it has done in the end. Unfortunately, that has been the case with the Bates TV drama, because even despite the fact that a public inquiry as a result of the Bates litigation was established in September of 2020, and at that stage it was a public inquiry, it wasn't a statutory inquiry. It still hadn't captured and caught the imagination of the general public in the way that it has done. It was 2021 that the public inquiry was converted to a statutory inquiry, and that was as a result of the judge dealing with the inquiry, Sir Win Williams, requesting the government raise the status of the inquiry from public inquiry to statutory inquiry. And that was on the back of the Criminal Court of Appeal ruling, which overturned the criminal convictions of, at that time, 39 sub-postmasters. And it was as a result of that Criminal Court of Appeal ruling and evidence which Sir Win Williams was hearing at that by then that caused him to say it needs to be changed from public to statutory inquiry. And we're still running with the inquiry at this stage. It's been at various phases. We're going to have an interesting phase shortly as Fujitsu starts to come into the equation. And as an aside, I think there's a select committee tomorrow at which Fujitsu are required to give evidence. So that's certainly one to watch. I think that starts at 10 o'clock. And I'll, again, if anybody's interested, I'll pop the link out to that as well. In 2022, the government set up a compensation scheme to award fair compensation to the 555 original Bates litigants, because prior to that, what they had was their 20,000 and that was it. And now at least something is being done to try and ensure that those 555 original litigants receive proper compensation too. I remember when the situation arose with this settlement of 58 million, even then Alan Bates would not let the matter lie and was looking at different ways of trying to ensure that the 555 got their proper compensation by having the costs properly met. And one of the things he looked at was a possibility of an appeal to the government ombudsman. And we were all asked to chip in, I can't remember whether it was about £50 or £100 to chip in those that were willing to some money into this pot to pay for the costs of that, which we did. And I'm not sure of what the status of that is now at the moment, but I would imagine that Alan Bates hasn't let that one go as well, because he's very much a belt and braces chap, and he'll keep riding two horses for as long as he can do. So then fast forward to the Bates TV drama. We knew that that was coming along. The story still hadn't got the kind of coverage that perhaps everybody had expected it to get. But the Bates TV drama has put things onto a completely different level, because it's introduced human beings to the story rather than facts and figures. And the dramatization, I think, has caught everybody by surprise. I mean, I've known about the situation for some time now, known the story, watched it unfold, and even I was surprised at the resultant hoo-ha that there's been, quite rightly, as a result of that litigation. And whereas before the drama, I think I had thought that there might be some criminal prosecutions, or the possibility of some criminal prosecutions. I wasn't even confident that there might be. Again, as a result of the TV drama, I think now, well, 2024, here we are, and the Metropolitan Police has confirmed that it's investigating the possibility of Post Office Limited employees and charges of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. And at the moment, the Post Office seems to be the gift that keeps on giving to journalists, because there's just one story after another after another. The latest one is the possibility of charges for fraud, in the sense that Post Office, so far as the compensation that has been paid out to date, they deducted that from the final accounts figures, in the sense that that would inflate the profits, and so inflate the bonuses payable to the senior directors. But on the other hand, when it came to accounting for tax, they did count the compensation payments, and so that reduced the tax. So they've played a very fast and loose game. We have now a situation in which the government just last week announced the primary legislation to exonerate all of the convicted postmasters. There's about 900 odd convicted postmasters, and to have dealt with those cases individually or in small tranches would have taken a hell of a long time to actually see the cases through. So quite astonishingly, the government's announced primary legislation to exonerate all of the convicted postmasters. And again, bear in mind that initially, when all of this was bubbling up, the government, if they were taken to task about what was happening with Horizon, they would say, well, we're only arm's length shareholder. This is a business decision with Post Office. We deal with this at arm's length and we can't get involved. Well, by goodness, they've not half got involved now with the primary legislation to exonerate all of the convicted postmasters. A question that's sometimes raised by some people when I speak to them is, bearing in mind the tactic that Post Office used when it came to convicting postmasters, they would charge the postmaster with theft and an additional count of false accounting. And they did that tactically from the point of view that they would offer to drop the charge of theft if the postmaster would accept the charge of false accounting. And the charge of false accounting came around because each week or each day when you complete your balance, and certainly at the end of each week when you do your trading statement, you sign off those accounts as saying the amount of cash that Horizon says you have on premises, you actually have on premises. So when Horizon is producing these glitches and saying you've got more on the premises than you actually have, you're signing an account to say, well, yes, even though you've got less, it matches with what they say. So a lot of people thought, well, surely they're still guilty of false accounting, these postmasters. But they're not, and they weren't, because when Justice Fraser gave his judgment in the common issues trial, the judgment actually found that returning inaccurate trading figures based on Horizon was not false accounting. And since then, the Criminal Case Review Commission has referred most of the cases that were remaining to the Court of Appeal. This is the largest referral that the Criminal Cases Review Commission has ever made in its history. And then, as I say, we have the primary legislation that's just been introduced to exonerate all of the convicted postmasters. I'm going to pause there because I'm conscious I've been talking for a while and some people might have some questions at this stage. What I would like to do is to briefly touch on the current problems that are facing sub-postmasters, because as if we haven't had enough problems with what's happened in the past with Horizon, there are an awful lot of problems that face serving postmasters going forward, and which threatens the future of post officers up and down the land as much as the fallout from the litigation does. So Carol, if you want to come back in at this stage, and if there are any questions, I'm quite happy to take them and answer them before, as I say, briefly. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time talking about the current problems that face sub-postmasters.
Yes, thank you very much, Sean. That's, we've seen the ITV drama, but it's, you've got some insider knowledge which we didn't have. So it's been a fascinating talk and shocking and just awful. I just don't know how they got away with it. Anyway, I've got loads of hands up already. I've got Ian, Mike, Tony, and Norman. So I'm going to bring them in. How would you like to take questions? Would you like me to give you 3 people and then you answer?
Yeah, I'll just stay in your hands, Carol, however you want to deal with it.
Well, if you might need a little pen and paper just to not jot down the questions that people are asking. So I'm bringing in Ian first and then Mike Hope.
Ian, hello.
Hi, I've got a couple of quick questions. First of all, about the politics, direct party politics of it. I saw Mr. Bates being interviewed about Ed Davey, who seems to be in the eye of the storm as one of the many ministers of post over this period. And he was saying actually he wasn't worse than any of the others, and he was probably being briefed by the civil servants in the post office anyway. But I was wondering about another party leader who was head of the prosecution service for some of this period. Now, I know that it's largely been private prosecutions. I did see one headline that said the CPS did take some prosecutions on behalf of the post office. Would it be the same situation being fair to a man I don't like, that he was also just being briefed and he was at the top of the tree, or is there any more traction there where maybe if he was across the whole thing as the head, he might have seen that this was happening a bit too much? Secondly, just about why it was being driven by the post office at all. Was it the same toxic, horrible culture, basically, that's always been anti-union that's come out in all the strikes? Was that at the root of it, or some dogmatism about technology being good and that's the end of it? And finally, about Paula Venables, that was mentioned in passing on Channel 4 News that she was in the running to be the Bishop of London. I didn't know she was anything to do with the church before. I think maybe she should be defrocked. But in any case, I then heard through the grapevine, I've not seen the article myself, that Giles Fraser was alleging Justin Welby was promoting her for Bishop of London, which might fit in with some of the rest of his political connections. But yeah, I suppose my main question is about Starmer, and then about the kind of anti-union side of why they've been so bad. Thanks.
I've seen Alan Bates, or heard about, been told about the interview that he did about Ed Davey. He was quite measured about that, and in response to that, and I think pointing at the real villains of the piece, going further down the path as well, all the way back to Fujitsu and Post Office. Keir Starmer, I'm mindful when I see the reports and read the reports pinning him with some of the CPS prosecutions, that there is already a dossier being prepared pre-election to hit Keir Starmer with a number of cases that he's alleged to have dealt with and shortcomings in relation to those cases. And I think that's probably just an attempt, principally by Tories, to do some mudslinging with that. As far as Starmer's concerned, the prosecutions were brought by the Post Office because since its inception, Post Office would bring its own prosecutions against postmasters or postmen and women, because that was the way it was going back all the way to the 16th century or so when Post Office was first established, and that's the way it ran forward. There is the possibility where a private prosecution is brought, whether that be by a company, a corporation, or a private individual. There is the possibility for the Crown Prosecution Service to intervene in that prosecution, and effectively they rock up at court and they say, stand aside for the Crown. And the Crown then intervenes. And normally in those situations, when it does arise, and it's quite rare, the Crown intervenes on the basis that they're not actually, they take over the prosecution and then they drop the prosecution. And it's pretty rare, and it's not something that's utilised very often. And I think the likelihood is Starmer wasn't necessarily aware that these prosecutions were going on with Post Office. So I think there's a bit of mudslinging that is being prepared for Starmer in relation to this. I'm not saying necessarily that he's whiter than white or pure as the driven snow in relation to this. I think all government officials and ministers that somewhere along the line have a hand in this. It's just a case of how deep their hands go with it. Paula Venables, you're right. She was and still is a minister of the church. I have seen as well, I think it's St. Albans is her diocese. And I think I've seen something as well and heard something about the bishop in that diocese saying, well, you know, putting up a defence for her. And in actual fact, one of the local papers in that area has asked me to give a quote for that, ready for their deadline come Wednesday. So I'm trying to think of something suitable and charitable to say to them about Venables with that, but I must admit I'm struggling, so I'll have to come up with something before Wednesday. But hopefully that answers those questions.
Thank you very much, Sean. I've got Mike Cope and then Tony Greenstein. So I'm just bringing Mike in.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, thanks for this, Sean. It's really comprehensive. First of all, just a basic factual question. You know, the big light that's been shone is obviously by the ITV drama, which, not having a TV, I haven't seen. But the thing that alerted me to this, I mean, apart from odd articles that I did see, there was quite a comprehensive series of sort of reportage programs on Radio 4.
Mm-hmm.
The guy did quite a big job. Are you saying, you know, given that Radio 4 has you know, this great Middle England listenership, are you saying that it didn't really kind of get much response from folks despite that? You know, it was a proper investigative reporting, the like of which we don't often see. So I'd be surprised at that. I mean, that's just the first question. The second is, I read something just in the last couple of days which suggested, I mean, we haven't really talked so much yet about Fujitsu, but this is, you know, Fujitsu and government and contracts and diplomacy, that back in the early Blair days, I think 1999 or 2000, the Japanese ambassador gave a very kind of blood-curdling threat to British government that, you know, they were not to get in the way of Fujitsu and they were to let the whole thing go ahead, which has therefore meant that ministers subsequently have, you know, taken the line that they have. I wondered, you know, how much truth there is in this. you know, and of the various politicians, I mean, we talked about Starmer. Ed Davey, well, he's a stupid man, and he, you know, I mean, he's probably no more culpable than any of the others, but he is a particularly stupid individual. I'm more interested in the other Lib Dem who was responsible for piloting the privatization of the post office, who's often characterized as a good guy, which is Vince Cable. Because seems to me nobody's really said anything about Vince Cable, and yet seems to me that he is likely to have the architecture that he created for the post office is likely to have had some effect here. I mean, the fact that the post office has been a disgrace ever since and declining, you know, all the promises of privatization just, you know, they are revealed for what they are. And the very final question is more a sort of philosophical one for us as Republicans, well, those of us who are Republicans, which I assume is most of us, which is when you give an organization crown powers and then you privatize it. So it's like having a large corporation with the powers of government. And I'm reminded of areas of Secret Service which operate alongside of companies like BAE Systems and others, which operate in a similar fashion. And then when you look at, you know, the Israeli companies, the link between states, you know, Tony, looking at you, Tony, Elbit Systems, and, you know, their extreme links with the Israeli state. So, you know, as Republicans, I think we really need to have something quite distinctive to say here.
Thanks very much, Mike. Let's go over to Tony. Tony, you're muted, Tony.
Not for the first time. Yeah, thanks. That was Mike's was a very interesting question because it relates to the power of private corporations, which nonetheless have the powers of the state. That's also the case with what was British Rail, the private rail companies. They also bring private prosecutions. And I think this is a question in democracy that no private corporation or company should have those powers. It really should be as simple as that. But of course, there are very close links between the tops of these companies and the state. I was going to ask, because I'm also in a position of not actually having watched the programs yet, partly because I was on a speaking tour when they were taking place. So that awaits me. But I have been aware for some time of this growing scandal. But the question I wanted to raise, apart from anything else, was it seems to me that the conviction of so many sub-postmasters, you'll know how many, also raises questions about the failure of the justice system itself. The mere fact that they could be convicted when they were innocent. And presumably judges ruled out evidence, refused to accept questioning, that the fact that there was a prima facie assumption that a computer cannot be wrong, which in itself poses all sorts of problems. I mean, I don't think these questions should be lost in, if you like, what has happened. We should not assume it because the courts have now moved to overturn convictions that they didn't get it wrong, and why did they get it wrong, and how did it occur, and what processes led to juries being told in essence that there was no case for the defense, which I imagine was the case in many trials. So I know that's a wholly new area in a sense for you, but I'm throwing it out.
Yeah, sure. Can I just
ask one or two more things before you come back on me? being totally ignorant of what the Postmasters Federation is, what is its role? If it's, you say it was a trade union, or if it was a trade union, presumably its primary purpose was defense of its members. But you're saying basically it was a sweetheart company union. So does it have any purpose? And how many postmasters are members, and how many are members now of the CWU branch? Because clearly, I mean, this organization is not fit for purpose. So yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk, and I do look forward to watching the whole of the programs as soon as I can find time to do so. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tony, and for keeping it very brief. I have a number.
Once you say, we're going to say.
I have a number. I have a number of other hands up. Can I bring one more person in, Sean, before you answer the question?
Yeah, sure.
Right, I'm going to bring Norm.
Thanks very much, Sean, for a very clear and detailed account of what's happening. I'm quite amazed at really some of the things that you brought out. But my question, very briefly, is about accountability. As you said, the post office at the moment is a private limited company. All the shares are owned by the government. But the government, when they were approached initially, so it's nothing to do with us. It's an arm's length organization. Does this really bring into question the way the post office is now owned? That there's a good case for moving it back from being a private company into back to what it used to be, where it was wholly controlled and organized, run by the government. I mean, do you think that would be helpful, and would that actually improve the question of accountability?
Very, very, very good question, Norman. Thank you. Thank you, Sean.
So, Mike, your question about Nick Wallace, which was the documentary that you mentioned that you listened to on Radio 4. It was a superb documentary. Nick Wallace has been an ardent campaigner on behalf of Subpostmasters since he first became involved. His involvement first arose when he was leaving the radio studio. He put out a call from the broadcast before he left, saying, if anybody's got a story, get in touch with me and let me know, because I'm looking for stories in the local area. He got into his taxi, and the taxi driver said, I've got a story for you. My wife has just been sent to prison and she's pregnant, and it's all to do with a problem with Horizon. And bang, the guy told Nick Wallace what was happening. Nick Wallace, one thing led to another, made contact with Carl Flinders, etc. And he's campaigned ardently on behalf of postmasters. He's had to be careful how he does it, because as a journalist, he has to be unbiased. He has to give the Post Office, Fujitsu, the National Federation, the opportunity to comment and come back at him regards things. He has to make sure that what he reports is 100% accurate, because pretty much all journalists live in fear of the possibility of litigation being brought against them for alleged inaccurate reporting. Sadly, all the work that he did, whilst making an impact and chipping away at things, it wasn't the watershed moment that the Bates drama has been. And every time there's been a documentary or a documentary series or a big splash in the papers, every time that's come along, we've all hoped this is going to be the watershed moment. And unfortunately, it's failed to be. And I can't think that there's any other reason for that, other than there's nothing resonates with the public the way that a TV drama can possibly do that. I think people have looked at some of the other TV dramas in the past that have had the same effect, going way back to 66, I think it was, with Kathy Come Home. And every now and then you have a drama that does that. And thankfully, from the point of view of Subpostmasters, that's what's happened with this drama. But it wasn't for the want of trying with those journalists who were campaigning, such as Nick Wallace and the Radio 4 documentary that you mentioned. The situation, Mike, with Fujitsu, I think undoubtedly money talks, and there's been pressure from Fujitsu on the government way back in 1999 when this project was first being unrolled with Fujitsu. There were problems that were being highlighted even back then. as an aside, the first trial post offices that this was rolled out to by Fujitsu and Post Office were actually in the northeast of England. And in my branch, which is West Bolton, the postmistress there, Margaret Davison, who is a member of the National Federation of Subpostmasters, and I'll come on to that membership organisation again in answer to, I think it was Tony's question. She and other postmasters in the northeast raised the problems that there were with Horizon. It was actually recorded at an NFSP meeting in the minutes that there were serious concerns with it, but it was swept under the carpet. And the reason that it was swept under the carpet was because Post Office had bet the farm on Horizon. The NFSP were in league with that sweetheart deal with Post Office. They were backing Post Office as far as Horizon was concerned. Fujitsu, they did, as I understand it, put some pressure on the government. I think there was at some stage a suggestion that they might withdraw from the deal, but the government was faced with the threat of legal action and further costs being required in order for them to extricate themselves from the deal that was going on. And I suppose it's a little bit like with the high-speed train debacle, wherever you stand with that, pro or against, the money that has been involved with that has just churned and churned and churned and churned and churned, and it's taken on a life of its own. I think that's what it was with Fujitsu as well, that it was going to cost them, they thought at the time, too much to get out of it than to stay in with it. Vince Cable, I think, he's certainly keeping his head down at the moment. There's a lot of finger pointing going on. Jo Swinson, she's keeping her head down at the moment. The finger pointing has gone on throughout in the statutory inquiry. There is a corporate amnesia. If you watch any of this, it's televised on YouTube Live when it's on. There is a disgusting corporate amnesia when you see the witnesses from Post Office giving evidence. Not that I recall, I can't recall. They may as well give a no comment interview. And I think we'll see more of this when Fujitsu takes stand as well. I'll come on to the issue of Crown powers and privatisation, because I think it touches as well on Norman's point about accountability and what might be the future of Post Office. Is it better going into government hands? I think quite often it is the case that money talks. I've long been of the view that it's not necessarily government that runs the country, it's big business, because they have the ability to silence, to lobby, to bribe, to cajole. And I think that's exactly what goes on. I don't think that the future of Post Office lies with Post Office Limited. Something has to change with that. There's discussion at the moment about the possibility of mutualisation and putting the Post Office back into the hands of Post Office postmasters to run with an oversight committee. I think that because there is an election coming up, this is possibly one of the reasons why politicians are now taking the interest in Post Office and Subpostmasters, which previously they didn't, because there's some advantage to be gained as to how they present themselves with this. Post Office cannot continue in its present form. Something has to change, and I think will change. To all intents and purposes, Post Office is bankrupt. It's only the fact of the government being its sole and only shareholder digging it out that it means it can continue to trade. Post Office is probably one of the last British institutions that we have. Everything else has been privatized. Well, Post Office has to all intents and purposes, but British institutions as we know them are fading and going, and Post Office is one of the last ones, and hopefully people will see enough in that to save it and want to save it. Tony mentioned the point about the NFSP and was it a trade union? How many members does it have? Well, it was initially a trade union. It was stripped of its trade union status because of an application to an employment tribunal, which found at the time that sub-postmasters were not employees. And because they weren't employees, that was one of the reasons that it was stripped of its trade union status. The National Federation of Sub-Postmasters is bought and paid for by Post Office Limited. It has a handful of directors. Postmasters are auto-enrolled to the Federation when they become a sub-postmaster. They don't have to do anything active to become a member. The whole raison d'etre for the NFSP as far as Post Office is concerned is because it is the only body that Post Office recognises as being a negotiating body on behalf of sub-postmasters. So it will only deal with the Post Office will only deal with the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. And of course, the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, because it's bought and paid for £2.5 million a year by Post Office, toes the party line with Post Office. So in reality, it doesn't negotiate. Post Office says jump, NFSP says how high. Justice Fraser, in his judgment in the Common Issues trial, was absolutely damning of the NFSP and said that it was not remotely independent of Post Office Limited. It's now having an attempt at rehabilitating itself. It is calling out Post Office on certain things. It's trying to rewrite history. It's succeeding to some extent. But I think as the Wynne inquiry moves on to its next phases, when it looks at the NFSP's involvement and the CWU's involvement, I think the NFSP is going to be found out. It's going to be very interesting to see the evidence that the NFSP brings forward. The CWU, unfortunately, we have just over 300 members, which in a network of about 11,500 post offices is not a huge amount. The reason why we have so few members is because postmasters are pretty much self-employed. They're struggling to make ends meet. And like anybody, when they're busy and they've got their head down and they're wondering where the next paycheck is coming from, they don't necessarily have time to look over their shoulder or look ahead and think, right, well, how can I best work to make things change? Yes, I should look at what's being said about the NFSP. They're not independent. They're not doing the best job for me that they can do. I should join a union rather than the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. And because postmasters are auto-enrolled to it, they see the numbers that there's about 7,500 members of the NFSP, and they think, yep, that's the organisation for me. So we have a lot to do to try and change people's perception of what it is that they're dealing with and where really they should be placing their money rather than the NFSP. I think I may have missed. Oh, I think, Tony, you mentioned the point about the justice system and a failing in the justice system. I think the justice system, to an extent, has failed sub-postmasters. We had a situation before the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 in which computers had to be proven to work. The burden of proof wasn't necessarily that the computer was always right. I think from the old electronic breathalyzers, the CAMAC machines, people would quite often challenge those and say, well, was the machine working? And people were walking off from drink driving charges because they'd successfully challenged these machines. So in 1984, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, largely as a result of those kind of cases, introduced the concept that the computer was always right, and there was a presumption that the computer was always right. And of course, that played right into the hands of Post Office with the Horizon litigation. So there weren't enough judges and there weren't enough lawyers properly challenging the evidence that was coming forward. There were some notable cases in which defence lawyers were asking for experts to be appointed. And in those cases, what you found was Post Office were quite often withdrawing from the case and letting people walk away from that, usually with a slap or gagging order as well, on the basis that, well, we'll not pursue this further if you just walk away quietly. Again, ironically, my branch, as well as Margaret Davison, who was one of the ones who trialled Horizon, had her own problems with it. Christopher Head, who I think has been seen quite widely on the news, he was a previous postmaster in my branch and found himself with an £80,000 hole in his accounts. So as you can imagine, the first thing that I did when I came into my branch was to say, right, take that equipment out, put new equipment in, and I'll join the Communication Workers Union, please, because I want something that's going to properly represent me and not simply as the National Federation did, which was to say, you're the only one. There's nothing we can do. Just hold your hands up to false accounting.
Thank you very much, Sean. A very comprehensive answer to those questions. I'm going to bring in John Spedding and then Ronald Corbin and Steve Freeman. So over to you, John Spedding.
Hi, John.
Unmute, there you go. Yeah, probably before your time, my dad was a postmaster, sub-postmaster in Northumberland as well. I want to know really what responsibility the likes of Adam Crozier and Moya Green, who were heads of Royal Mail Group when they owned Post Office Limited before Paula Vessels took the helm in April 2012, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones who were in charge of letting the system and obviously in charge when the system was really experiencing its real first problem. And equally, what about I know the political class have all got so much rubbish in there that they're all trying to distance themselves. But my understanding is that the Horizon system was part of a joint system, which was going to be the DWP to do gyros and benefit system and also run the post office. And the DWP, Harriet Harman, for her sins, canned it. She realised there were faults in it, but Post Office Limited and Royal Mail Group and whoever was in charge of them from a political point of view didn't do it for the post office. My view is that it all goes back to money, and the Conservatives and Tony Blair were all interested in reducing the cost of their system. Instead of getting the system right, they wanted to get it cheap. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Thank you. Bit less than 3 minutes, I hope.
Yep. Well done, John. Ronald, I'm bringing Ronald in now.
Yes, mine's more in nature of a short comment rather than a question. And my worry is that when the Labour Party does become the government at the next election, and it almost certainly will, whatever our views are about the leader of the Labour Party may be, mine aren't charitable, I have to say, it will very much depend upon the politicians as to whether, if they bring the post office back into public ownership, as they should, whether that will have any real effect, whether politicians will take responsibility. And that's a big issue. The other thing, it minds the business of compensation for post office workers and so on. Very much reminds me of something that was current when I was a nurse, a psychiatric nurse, and that is the thalidomide situation. Here we are 70 odd years later, and still thalidomide sufferers have not been properly compensated. I do hope that this isn't going to be the same for the postmasters, You know, they deserve compensation. They've been wickedly treated, and they should be properly compensated. Finally, your question about this woman who's been nominated to be a bishop. I think, well, you know, if she can be nominated to be a bishop, given her sins, shall we say, it might be reasonable to nominate Lucifer for Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah, that's my 2 pennyworth.
Thanks very much, Ronald. Yes, I liked your last 2 comments. I'm going to bring Steve Freeman in now. Here's Steve.
Sure, Sean, thank you, Sean. That was great. And sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes or so because my internet went down. I was struggling to get on, so I missed that first bit, but it was very, very informative. I got a question and a sort of comment that's come from others. The question was, obviously, this goes back to this whole neoliberal Thatcher Blair type of reorganization of the state that was going on, as comrades have already said. But I have been wondering whether this was a system of actually simply extracting money, like a kind of, in other words, rather than it being like this accident and these things happened and by some mistake in some computer program that we don't really understand why this mistake was there, you know, the code went wrong or something or other. But actually somebody hit upon a new way of extracting money out of these post office masters and mistresses, whatever. In other words, we could just steal 800 quid. We could steal so many thousands of pounds off them and then terrify the life out of them if they didn't shut up, because a lot of people were so frightened by this, they just paid up anyway. It's like a system of deliberate extraction. And if it's a system of deliberate extraction, then it seems a lot worse than the way it's kind of been presented to us. It was just like the mistakes were made and we didn't really understand that computers don't work anyway. So that's my first question to you. Is it more sinister than we've perhaps been sinister, you know, more exploitative than we've been led to believe? And then I want to just comment on, and I don't have the answer to this, but obviously as a Republican group, we're always rethinking on the kind of Republican angle, which we don't have, but comrades have already started to, you know, we have to work on it and look at every case and example, the bigger picture. So I want to just throw out the bigger picture for us as Republicans is that this nexus of power, which we call the crown, we're not talking about the king here, by the way, we're talking about ministers, we're talking about civil servants, judges that Tony brought into the story as well. This nexus of power, and police, you could put that in there, obviously, and then Fujitsu and the post office are all tied in with that nexus of power. And that's why it seems incredibly difficult to solve the problem. And I was thinking, if we jumped outside the post office for a minute, we started thinking about Hillsborough, we started thinking about Grenfell Tower, we started thinking about the blood scandal and various others. These things seem to be incredibly, I mean, it's like incredibly difficult to do anything about. And it takes like at least 30 years for us even to get anywhere near. Now, why is that? It's because the power system is so, I should say, resistant. Really massively resistant. And that takes us back to what Norman said, really, about accountability and secrecy, which the system is so good at doing. And I thought of this failure of memory. So the failure of memory, I thought, what about Sunak and Johnson, who couldn't remember one thing from one day to the next of what happened during the COVID scandal? I mean, what the hell happened there? They kept going, oh, I've no idea. And so everybody seems to have had a big failure of memory. And I think my last point was this, that failure of memory, it seems to be a get out of jail free card. Well, really, I think this failure of memory should be a go straight to jail or don't collect £200 type card. You know, when will we have a legal system, as Tony says, that will put these people in jail as opposed to the people who ended up in jail? How come nobody's gone to jail for this except the victims of it? And that to me is an absolute outrage. And it does point to a complete broken political system, a constitution, a system of law that just simply doesn't work.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I think, you know, when you talked about people actually going to prison, you think a woman, a pregnant woman, went into prison and I believe spent her entire pregnancy in prison. That is appalling. That poor woman should be awarded millions in compensation. I can't imagine anything worse than having to go to prison for something you didn't do and spend your pregnancy there. It's just appalling. Well, thank you very much, Steve.
The situation, John, Harriet Harman, yes, she did point out some problems with Horizon. The Horizon system, it was designed to deal with the DWP payments. It was designed to carry out a whole tranche of other activities, and a lot of computer experts at the time said that it was something that was being designed to do too much to...
So saying you can't qualify it as a block stop and full genocide because that notion was okay. Not just...
Sorry, someone appears to be have something else going. Sorry, I think I've solved it.
I think
Sorry about that.
The suggestion was that the system was too much was being expected of the system to be done for too little. And I think it was destined to fail from that point of view. The involvement of Crozier et al. When post offices were being run by Royal Mail before they were hived off and privatized themselves. I think there has been a connection, hasn't there, between Adam Crozier and his appointment as a director with ITV, having hopped from Royal Mail and what was going on with Postmasters. His name is, well, is it because of his connection with ITV that his name hasn't cropped up? But I think overall the difficulty was, despite the problems that were being raised by, for example, Harriet Harman, the situation was they were too deep into things and they had bet the absolute farm on this, because we had and have a network of post offices which was much larger then, and the expectation back then was that everything had to make a profit. The trains had to make a profit, the buses had to make a profit, everything was profit, 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 and it had to run itself, and the post office was no exception with that. And everybody lost sight of the fact of the social purpose to post office as well, and that not every government department or institution is there to make a profit, it's there to provide a service. And I think people lost complete sight of that. Ronald, you asked, will politicians take some responsibility? And I think that question must have been rhetorical, because we all know here that politicians will not take any responsibility, and there will always be finger pointing and trying to move the blame down the line, kick the can down the line. And that is exactly what's been going on with Post Office. As the scandal has unfolded, and more recently following the Bates drama, as people are trying to point the finger at each other. And it's mirrored, as I said, in the Wynne inquiry as well, the finger pointing that goes on, the corporate amnesia. The compensation issue, Ronald, I think I am seriously worried about the mechanisms for awarding proper compensation to postmasters. I pointed out when Minister Hollenrake had made his announcement in the House last week about the primary legislation to exonerate all postmasters, and that the offer of £75,000 was being made. I think he actually phrased it as a payment. No, it's an offer of £75,000 to the 555 postmasters in the Bates litigation. And I said on the interview, I said, the devil is in the detail here, because that is an offer. It's not a payment. He's made it out to be a payment. If a postmaster in that situation says, I'm not taking £75,000 because it's not enough, then he has to wait until his case is assessed. He doesn't get £75,000 up front whilst it's being assessed. Just in the same way as far as those who were wrongly convicted have been offered £600,000. If they take £600,000, that's it, that's an end of it. But if they don't take the £600,000, they have to wait until their case is properly assessed. And I think that the object behind the operation of these compensatory schemes is, above all else, to delay as far as possible, to obfuscate, to make it as difficult as possible. For example, the historical shortfall scheme that's open to postmasters, If they want to apply, they have to. I think Dan Needle did a really good thread on Twitter about this. They have to complete a 15-page document, which even he as a legal professional and myself as a legal professional, you know, it takes time to complete, and you need some legal advice and legal assistance to do that. And there's no payment of legal costs for applicants in that scheme unless they get to a point at which they're going to accept, and then there's a small limited payment that's made to them. It's nothing like enough that they need to be able to properly assess the claim. So these claims are being undersettled. 2,000 of them have been settled as things are. One of the things that we're looking at is some way of actually reopening the 2,000 claims that have already been settled, because the vast majority of them have been settled without legal advice, and more likely than not, when claims are settled without legal advice, they're undersettled, because you don't have an equality of arms here. You've got highfalutin post office lawyers who are administering the scheme in the sense of making those offers on the basis of the paperwork that comes through to them. So I think as far as compensation is concerned, I think the post office's objective, and in that sense the government's as well, remains to try and pay out as little as they can possibly get away with. And time is their greatest ally in this, because many of these postmasters are an age where sadly they ain't going to be around much longer to be able to pursue that properly. And also, the longer that goes by, the greater the possibility is that they were just so weary of it, they say, okay, well, I'll take that. I've no doubt that some of those 555 who really should hang out for more than £75,000 are going to say, look, I've had enough of this. I'm going to take the £75,000. Steve, you wondered whether or not there was something sinister in the situation of the Horizon faults, and whether or not it was a way of extorting money out of postmasters and filling the coffers. Frankly, nothing would surprise me in this scandal. I haven't heard that put forward by anybody else at this stage, but really, with everything that has happened with this, nothing would actually surprise me. The money that has been extorted in that situation from Subpostmasters, for example, the historical shortfall scheme that we've talked about, it's not there to repay just that money back to the postmaster. It's there to compensate them as well. So if you've had a hole in your Horizon system of £20,000-30,000, that scheme isn't just there to repay you that £30,000. It's there to compensate you for your loss of livelihood, your loss of health, etc., etc., etc. So, Steve, nothing would surprise me if it were to be the case that was there deliberately to extort money from Subpostmasters.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Sean. John has a question which I'll read out. He's put it in the chat. John Tumman, when I worked in the legal action section of the now defunct Commission for Racial Equality, we had a new computer system foisted upon our work, which slowed us down enormously. The problem turned out to be that the CRE had not purchased a bespoke system for our work, but something off the shelf. Could Horizon have been similar? And I've also got a question that I'd like to ask, if I may. What about the sub-postmasters who actually use their life savings to cover the shortfalls that Horizon was actually generating? Is there any chance that they will be compensated as well? And Phil Vellender had his hand up. But
yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you, Sean, for a very comprehensive overview and analysis of what's happening. I think Private Eye deserve a plug. They picked up where Computer Weekly left off for a while, and they've kept on at this for 11 years. So I think we really should be clapping them on the back as well. In the current issue, there's quite a lot of stuff about it. A couple of observations. Yes, Vince Cable undersold the post office or Royal Mail when he privatised it. He got nothing like the amount of money he should have done, and in every regard sold the thing down the river. So if anyone deserves the villain's mask, it's Vince Cable. we certainly should be reminding people of that fact. I think another thing I'd say most of this is covered in Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy. If you talk about the law's delay, the proud man's contumely, the arrogance of office, it's all there. I mean, it goes back 500 years. But what we're talking about there was actually a crown as a crown. Here we've got a crown as a kind of very complicated network of power, as Steve has alluded to. But what is also interesting is how many of these scandals have occurred. And they've occurred because they happen to be able to happen without any redress, because the Crown doesn't have to do anything. When people say they want things to be more accountable, the answer, as Tony pointed out, is more democracy. And that can't occur in our current 1688, 300-year-old lash-up of a constitution. It simply is not available to us. So when people like now are saying, slightly going off the point a tiny bit, that we should have talked to Parliament before he bombed Yemen, well, he doesn't need to talk to Parliament. Parliament's as irrelevant as a blush on a dead man's cheek. When it comes to taking those decisions, as Prime Minister and head of the executive, he can do what he wants. And that seems to be another issue over the losses they've suffered. There were losses suffered over the 2007-8 crash. Nobody got compensation for that. Nobody got jailed. Nobody's been jailed for any of these things. I think there will be no jailing over COVID. I don't think there's going to be any criminal proceedings from COVID. I don't think there will be from Grenfell. In this country, the art school dance goes on forever, and it seems that we're not going to be seeing any justice, and it can't be justice without democracy. And that is why, as Republicans, we believe that you've got to start with getting rid of the Crown in Parliament, sovereign in Parliament structure, and put sovereignty in the hands of the people. And then they'll have to answer to us, not just to a bunch of MPs who actually only represent us. They don't actually aren't forced to take any particular action. So thank you, Steve, but I wish you all the best.
Thanks very much, Phil. We've got Norman wants to come back and have another bite of the cherry. So I'm going to add Norman, and then I think we've got to bring this Q&A session to an end.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is my second go, so I'll be very brief. I just wondered, what sort of legal representation did the sub-postmasters have when they were originally charged? I mean, did they have any at all? And if they did, didn't any of the lawyers who were supporting them, did none of them actually suspect that something was wrong somewhere?
Very good question, Norman. Excellent question. So back to you, Sean.
Starting in reverse then with Norman and the question about legal representation. What kind of legal representation did most of these sub-postmasters have? Initially, an interview, when they were interviewed by post office investigators, and if anybody's watched anything of the Wynne inquiry, they will have seen some of these investigators and nasty pieces of work they were. Quite often the sub-postmaster was there on their own. A little bit like Lee Castleton, they had complete misplaced faith in the British judicial system, that they thought, I've done nothing wrong, and if I've done nothing wrong, I'll be found to have done nothing wrong. If they had any representation in the interview, it was usually from an NFSP rep. And their position was, as already stated, you're the only one. And quite often it was a case of, well, look, why don't you just put your hands up to, if it's not you, it's a member of staff, but, you're the only one. It's not happening to anybody else. That was the extent of their representation more often than not in interview. When they were subsequently charged, I suspect it was the position with many of the lawyers dealing with their cases that where a plea bargain was offered to them, and on the basis of that presumption in PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, that the computer is assumed to be right, possibly a bit of lazy lawyering, where the plea bargain was offered to them of false accounting, pleading guilty to that, dropping the charge of theft, and meaning that you're probably not going to go to prison. Quite often, these postmasters said, right, well, that's what I'm going to go for. You had a situation in which some lawyers were asking for expert reports, and where they were provided, I think there's the instance, I can't remember the name of the particular claimant, but there was an expert report provided. When that happened, Post Office backpedaled and withdrew. But again, there were stipulations to that, and gagging was going on as well because they didn't want this feature to be broadcast. Poor Seema Misra, just at the point that she was being jailed, I think one of these other cases where there was an expert report was being dealt with. And whereas there is a duty on the prosecutor, whether or not that be in the Crown Prosecution Service or in the case of a private prosecution, to lay the evidence before the court, whether or not it's helpful or unhelpful to the case, Post Office Limited were quite simply not following that requirement. And they were burying the evidence that would have assisted quite a lot of the defendants. So the judicial process and legal representation in many and most of these cases failed the sub-postmasters because, as I say, a bit of lazy lawyering as well, probably, where there was a plea bargain being offered, they were being urged to take the plea bargain and plead guilty to false accounting to avoid a conviction for theft, largely on the basis of that presumption in PACE that the computer is always right. How do you fight that? Well, you've got to get an expert's report. An expert's report is going to cost money. And as so often, we come back to the issue of money. There is no equality of arms in the judicial system that we have, especially and more recently since the demise of legal aid. Whoever has the deepest pockets will succeed, as has been the case with the Bates litigation. As I say, effectively, they ran out of money, so they had to take the settlement that they did, and they did very well to get it, but had they been able to go on, they would have secured a much better settlement. Criminal proceedings. I think, Phil, you had wondered about that and whether or not we're going to see any criminal proceedings in this instance when there haven't been criminal proceedings in so many other national scandals. I think prior to the Bates drama, I had actually wondered whether or not there would actually be any criminal proceedings. I thought that in the Wynne inquiry, there was enough finger pointing to other people, enough corporate amnesia for them to possibly get away with this, notwithstanding the fact that Justice Fraser had referred two witnesses in the Bates trial to the DPP. I was beginning to think that there's just going to be enough obfuscation and finger pointing, and it's not me, Gov, and I was only obeying orders kind of thing, for there to possibly not be any criminal proceedings. The Bates litigation makes me think twice now, and I think that there is the possibility that there will be criminal proceedings, but whether or not they secure a conviction, I'm not convinced of. I would like to think that they will, but again, you're going to see a situation, I predict, in which the people charged will be given access to top-notch lawyering in terms of their defence. And it may be the situation that there is too much confusion and obfuscation to be able to pin the tail on somebody properly, and they may be acquitted and get away. You might see a situation in which trials are collapsing as well. So I think the short answer to that is I think we will see some criminal proceedings, but whether or not we see convictions secured remains to be seen. Carol, and sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person whose question that you read out, but quite rightly, Private Eye should be given a good deal of credit here as well, and Carl Flinders, because there isn't just one journalist who's been responsible for bringing the story out and getting it to the point where it was thought to produce a TV drama. There's been a number of them at various stages. And in fact, Carl Flinders from Computer Weekly, he wasn't the original journalist at Computer Weekly. I think it was Rebecca Thompson who had taken the story first off. And when she left Computer Weekly, Carl Flinders asked if he could take on the mantle and carry on that story on her behalf and Postmaster's behalf. So there's a lot of credit to be given to a lot of people. You'd wondered about Fujitsu and whether or not, in common with another computer system, the Race Equality Board, which was foisted on them, and it wasn't something that was tailor-made. I think there was some suggestion that Horizon wasn't fit for purpose in that sense because it was being used as a one-size-fits-all. So whereas it was suitable for certain tasks, it wasn't suitable for other tasks, but it was jemmied in. It just had to fit, and it was a one-size-fits-all. And that was where, you know, a large part of the problems lay in the architecture of the system, that it wasn't fit for purpose, but it was made to be fit for purpose. And as I said, Post Office had bet the farm on this system working. It had to work. It was too big to fail, and ultimately it has failed. And the current cost of the litigation, defending the litigation and the compensation, it runs into billions, a couple of £1 billion.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Sean. I know that Steve, just make myself visible. I know that Steve brought the idea that something more sinister was going on. It certainly has occurred to me as well. And the fact that these sub-postmasters or mistresses were offered theft or false accounting, that's very suspicious, isn't it? If you take the false accounting, then you won't go to prison. So I find that very, very suspicious. I mean, either it was an overzealous protection of the post office, or there was something much more sinister behind that. Steve wants to come back in. I think we'll give one more chance. Steve, if you can be really...
Yes, I will be very brief, but it just reminded me of something that's quite important, and it is hiding in the background here, which was Tony Benn's idea, or not just Tony Benn's idea, that the law is a public good, and that we need access to law for the welfare of the Commonwealth, as it were. You know, that was what he said. And in his Commonwealth Bill, his Republican Bill, back in 1993, he included the idea of a national legal service, like the National Health Service, that to have a system of justice, every citizen, and not just the rich who can afford everything, every citizen should have access to the law. And it's the only way that the people can help to ensure that there is justice on so many issues. And that's no surprise that the law, access to law is being cut and cut and cut for that very opposite reason. And I think we've got to, as I left, put Tony Benn's idea of a national legal service, part of our Commonwealth, our future of our English Commonwealth, as we call it. But anyway, it should be put on the table as part of what we're campaigning for.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Steve. Right. Thank you very much for that. Now, I know, Sean, that you wanted to talk a little bit about the very bad position that sub-postmasters and mistresses find themselves in at the moment. And I'd love to hear that. So I'm going to give over to you again so that you can tell us a little bit about the appalling situation they find themselves in.
Thank you, Carol. I don't know how long your meetings normally go on for, so I'm conscious that I've probably been on for longer than perhaps you'd expected. So I'll be very brief in terms of the current problems that sub-postmasters face. The misconception is that postmasters are paid a salary. Postmasters used to be paid a salary. Network transformation came along in 2010. And again, this was this idea that Post Office should make a profit, that despite the fact that it was a public service, it should nevertheless be profitable. And network transformation saw the offer of a £1.3 billion grant to Post Office on the basis that it would change the way in which the network operated. So you went from a lot of mains post offices, pretty much all post offices were the fortress style. Those numbers were going to be reduced to 3,000. We had a system of field change advisors, they were called, coming in to introduce the transaction related payments. So the postmaster would lose their salary, and instead they would be given a transaction related payment for each transaction carried out on the counter. The 30 pieces of silver to the postmaster for them sacrificing their salary was, well, we'll tart up your shop, we'll do up your shop, because you'll lose this fortress counter with the big glass screen in front of it. And you'll get this little local counter that most people are more familiar with, the completely open counter. And quite a lot of postmasters went for that, and they went down that line. And consequently, you have a situation now in which the vast majority of postmasters receive transactional payments. They don't actually receive a salary. The only ones who do still receive a salary are certain community branches out in the sticks kind of thing, where they're the only facility for miles and miles around. And to preserve that facility, the postmaster still has a salary. But gradually, those postmasters with salaries are being lost. So by way of example, my branch, initially, the postmaster had a salary. When it was Chris Head was suspended because of the Horizon shortfall on his system, at that stage, when the new postmaster came in, the contract wasn't being transferred on the basis of it having a salary. It was a completely new contract. Because the postmaster had been suspended, that contract had come to an end and wasn't being transferred. So the only basis on which it could carry on was as a local with a transactional payment. And the problem with a transactional payment is, by way of example, if I sell a first-class stamp, I'm paid a commission of around 6p. Nick Reed, the chief executive of Post Office, was paid a £455,000 bonus on top of his salary. For me, or postmasters, to come anywhere near £455,000, we'd need to sell more than 6 million stamps to make that. We're in a situation that the banks are closing, bank branches are closing, and more post offices are dealing with the cash drought. We're taking up the slack in terms of the cash being paid in and cash being paid out. But we're not provided with any of the equipment to count the notes. We have to do that manually. We have a situation in which banks have different rules to each other as regards the amounts that customers are allowed to pay in. So you can quite often have a situation in which you're counting in a few £1,000s, only to find that when the customer puts their card in, the transactions declined because they've gone over their limit. And you've lost however much time there in terms of trying to sort that out. Nick Reed himself and Post Office, they're diluting the Post Office network. We're having a lot of pick-up and drop-up points that are being put into basic retail shops, which are Post Office badged, and they're allowing people just to drop in packages that can be scanned and taken in, or pick up a package. They don't offer any cash transactions or traditional Post Office transactions. But what they do is they maintain the network numbers for Post Office, but in terms of the postmasters in that immediate area, they dilute the number of transactions that are available to them to increase their commissions. The post office, as I've said, they will only recognise the National Federation of Subpostmasters for negotiation purposes. They will not recognise the Communication Workers Union for bargaining or negotiation purposes. The NFSP has no experience in terms of negotiation. Post Office says jump, they say how high. We had an employment tribunal application last year where this was brought by the CWU on behalf of the sub-postmaster members. We were seeking a declaration of worker status. If we had been given worker status, it would have opened us up to the right to paid holidays. It would have opened it up to the right for collective bargaining rights and membership. Unfortunately, we lost that application. I believe that the reason that we lost the application was largely for public policy reasons, because quite simply, they didn't want us to have that status. And yet again, the NFSP, it did not support the employment tribunal application in the same way as it didn't support the Bates litigation either. And all of this combined together with rising overheads, rising energy costs, many post offices who have had fixed energy contracts, they're coming to an end, and suddenly they're finding the energy bill in some cases doubling, in some cases literally trebling. And these overheads are crippling them. And I think you're going to see a situation very shortly in which a lot of branches are going to start to close. And as I said before, there really needs to be a root and branch change in terms of the post office for the future and how that is run. I think something will happen. It has to happen because post office is very much under the spotlight at the moment, and there is an election. And I think as a result of that, we may see change. Whether or not it's the kind of change that we want, I don't know. Sometimes, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. We'll simply have to wait and see. But postmasters are in a perilous situation at the moment in terms of their continued longevity. And I think the risk is that, the country will lose another institution. And before we know it, it will be gone.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, whenever I go into a post office, there's always a queue of people up into the door. And this is a public service. But this government is determined not to fund it. It's a national disgrace. They've got two people who want to ask you questions again. So I'm going to ask these people, please, can you make it as brief as possible? So first of all, it's Paul Collins. Paul, can you put your video on so I can spotlight you?
I haven't actually plugged my camera in.
Oh, that's
so,
fine. Okay. So if you just speak, that'll be fine.
Hello, Sean.
Hello, Paul.
My question is about the post office and social security benefits. Now, I remember years ago, I used to get social security disability allowances via paying in book, as they used to be called. And when the government changed the rules about the way they wanted to pay it in, they wanted people to pay in directly by their bank. And I said, well, I'd rather do it directly, have the money, the physical money, and go to the post office. So the postmistress told me of a way that I could do that, and that was called the post office card account.
That's right.
Now, so that leads me on to my question. Now that the government has done away with the post office card account, and you mentioned, yes, I did know about the payment by transaction rather than the share of the amount of whatever the transaction was made, if that makes sense. Does that mean that the decision to close the post office card accounts was a factor because it meant that they no longer had to pay the Subpostmasters those transactions for withdrawing social security payments? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I've got Tony. Tony's hands up again. Tony, I'm bringing you in.
Thank you. If I have a second bite of the cherry. Firstly, can I say what an excellent talk and illustration, an introduction to this. And I'm looking forward to looking at those videos which I missed. Can I just ask you a few questions? Firstly, how many people were wrongly convicted and how many were jailed? Secondly, given the uselessness of the Post Office Federation group, why do people remain members? And also, is this not a golden opportunity for you to recruit and to increase from 300 or so to 3,000 or more? I mean, on the back of the Bates thing, I mean, you should be producing surely a national leaflet, which is distributed to every post office, basically saying, what the hell, if you get into trouble, they will not be your friend. I mean, you should be able to decimate them. I mean, it just seems ripe to grow the CWU branch into a force to be reckoned with and to then demand representation on the basis of a simple ballot or what have you. But surely we must take this forward and what's happened in order that, I mean, this useless group is buried in the sand.
Absolutely, Tony. A very good question. So I'm going back to you, Sean, now to
Yeah. Paul, just to answer your question about the post office card account and the difference in transaction payments. Post office card account is a very good example because recently, I think a couple of years ago, the government got rid of the post office card account and forced benefits recipients to have that money paid into their bank account. The difference for postmasters in terms of the transactional payment was actually quite large because whereas with the post office card account, we received what was called an ad valorem payment, which was a percentage. That percentage, once it's paid into the bank account, it became a different kind of transaction because we didn't see it paid into the bank account. Obviously, it was the benefit recipient that did. And at that point, we would only receive a transaction commission if the benefit recipient chose to come to post office to withdraw their money. Whereas with the post office card account, they would have to come to the post office. And it wasn't a case of, in that sense, forcing them to. Many benefits recipients preferred it that way. They wanted to deal with the cash. They knew where they stood with it. Whereas putting into their bank account, a bank account that they might not have previously operated, they didn't know where they stood with it. But the whole transactional payment was completely different with post office card account, which was a higher percentage, a higher transactional payment than it was and is for a banking transaction. So again, postmasters, despite the fact that they wanted, as did the benefits recipients want to as well, to retain the post office card account, postmasters lost out and benefit recipients lost out. And there were bully boy tactics used in that situation as well, where recipients of benefits were being written to with misleading letters telling them that they were going to have to close their account. The letters were framed in such a way that they were made to fear for how their benefit would continue unless they made arrangements to open a bank account and have it paid into a bank account. There was a suggestion that that had to be done sooner than it actually did. So the government itself assisted in the demise or the early demise of the post office card account. Tony, your point about the convictions and how many postmasters were jailed, I think from memory there were 940 convictions. I don't know of the 940 how many were actually jailed. I think the larger proportion of those convicted were given suspended sentences. The convictions were not in the majority, as far as I know. As I say, it was largely suspended sentences, but even a suspended sentence it is too much. And in that person's community, they were pariahs. Again, the example of Christopher Head in my branch, although Post Office didn't pursue the prosecution against him, the criminal prosecution, because this happened at around about the time of the JFSA group and certain advisors coming to light with the Post Office, that they said internally, right, well, we'll stop prosecuting, criminally prosecuting. They did still pursue civil proceedings against postmasters. And in Chris's situation, he actually just had to, he literally fled the country. That was the only option that was available to him. Regards the NFSP and the CWU, okay, the situation is, as I say, when you become a sub-postmaster, you are auto-enrolled to the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. You have no choice about it. You don't have to say you want to become a member. In order not to be a member, you have to actively say, I do not want to be a member. The vast majority of postmasters believe that the NFSP is looking after their interests. At the time of the Horizon problems, Mark Baker was helping an awful lot of sub-postmasters out. The word spread and membership increased. I said that one of the first things I did was to join the CWU. I was probably a little bit more switched on and thought, that's what I'm going to do. I don't want the NFSP looking after me. They're not going to look after me. But the vast majority of postmasters, I'm afraid, they have the post office as an add-on to their business. They're looking over their shoulder all the time, trying to make a living, and they're not necessarily thinking of what or who is looking after them. The biggest recruiting sergeant for the CWU was the situation in which post office were persecuting and chasing sub-postmasters. People were hearing about the CWU and what it was doing and joining to get that protection for themselves. But once post office stopped, and they've pretty much stopped, well, they've stopped any criminal prosecutions, but they've pretty much stopped audits, they've pretty much stopped any proceedings against postmasters, civil or internal. So everything's gone quiet. And so postmasters aren't seeing the same necessity to join the CWU. And that's the kind of status quo there is at the moment. We are having a big membership push. In actual fact, I've got another event that I'm doing, which is an open event to serving postmasters and CWU members on Wednesday. The objective is to try and encourage membership. But it's pretty much an uphill struggle because, as I say, Post Office refuses to negotiate with any other body other than the NFSP for obvious reasons. And that creates the impression amongst postmasters that the NFSP are looking after their interests. The NFSP, with a grant of £2.5 million a year, has a huge budget for PR. Although the Subpostmasters branch is part of the CWU, given the numbers that we have, we're very much a junior partner within the CWU. So we don't have access to the same budget to be able to put the same kind of spin out there as the NFSP are managing to do. Hopefully that will change in the future.
Thank you very much. Just spotlight myself. Thank you very much indeed, Sean. It's been truly revelatory, and your explanations and answers to questions have been excellent.
Thank you.
I think, really, really. And I think we've now done nearly 2 hours. So I think I'm going to actually draw the meeting to a close now. I'll have the recording, of course, and I will be sending that out to members so that this can go to a wider audience than those who are here. But thank you so much, Sean, for giving us 2 hours of your time as well. It's quite a
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
But I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody now and extend the thanks of everybody. I can see there's lots and lots of comments in the chat saying great meeting, excellent. So thank you very much indeed for coming and talking to us.